And that's number one. Number two is you can actually, the way you raise money for a crypto company is completely opposite of how you raise it for a normal company. Normal company, you raise a seed round from angel investors, then you do a Series A, Series B, all the way to an IPO. Crypto company, you literally IPO on day one. You just kind of start selling tokens. And so immediately you're liquid, immediately it's trading, and immediately there's like a whole bunch of people who can permissionlessly invest in your business. So your investor base is much larger, and you also measure it every day in the market. So it creates an extremely different dynamic. And then, of course, because you're building like these little Lego blocks as opposed to building an entire company, a single individual can just have an enormous amount of leverage. The most extreme example is, of course, the Bitcoin white paper, where Satoshi, and then working later with Hal Finney and others, basically launched Bitcoin with an incredibly small number of people. So very, very small number of people behind Bitcoin. You could argue that the breakthrough in Bitcoin was just writing the white paper. It wasn't even writing the code. Once Satoshi had written the white paper, his or her job was done. So that's kind of another way you can have these very atomized, micro-sized firms. Yet another way in which they differ is that these are protocols. These aren't companies, right? And protocols have communities attached. They have peer governance. They can actually outlive the original developers. They can even outlive the original company. Some crypto companies set up the protocol and then they dissolve the company. You can have anonymous contributors. You can literally have people like in the Monero blockchain, there are coders who code for Monero and nobody knows who the heck they are. You can pay people anonymously. You can pay them, based on the price of the coin. You can incent the community in ways that you just can't do in the normal world because you can pay them each in crypto tokens. So the scope of how you build a company is completely different. I think it's all up for grabs. And we're seeing all kinds of models being tested in this massive Cambrian explosion. And we're going to end up with things that look very, very different. One thought I had a while back was like, maybe someone should set up like a completely crypto company and where all the people who are working on it are anonymous. They're just known by their public keys, and they're all paid, through some kind of a smart contract. All the customers are basically also, when they buy something, when they contribute revenues into the company, it goes in through a smart contract. The shareholders are all held on their cap tables are all held in the blockchain, and the profits are automatically paid out. And at first I thought, wow, this is so interesting. This is what the future is going to look like. We're going to take companies and we're going to redo them crypto style. And then I realized, no, actually, we're not, because these things look completely different. They don't even look like normal companies. They look like quasi governments slash nations slash movements, where some people are getting paid and some people aren't, and some are just incented by the protocol, and it's not clear who's working for who, and sometimes they're fighting and they're forking the protocol. You can't fork a company. You don't see like mutinies happening where like the code gets forked and company suddenly splits into two competing companies with a customer base is choosing sides. That never happens. But in crypto land, that happens all the time. Whereas in normal company land, you see acquisitions happen all the time. But in crypto land, that basically never happens. Or if it does, it's a sign that that wasn't really a crypto project. That was just more of a centralized company in the first place. So crypto has its own rules, its own ecosystem, its own behavior. And I think it's fascinating to watch how it evolves. And it's also one of the reasons why VCs are having a really tough time playing in the space, because it's very hard to figure out how to invest in these things. They don't look like normal companies. So if you're a venture capitalist, your LP agreements don't envision any of this. Just all of a sudden, like a hedge fund, you're running out and buying tokens, or you're investing in grants or like decentralized projects, or you're actually, some of the VCs running yield, staking and mining farms, or they're literally running miners. Or for example, with your game, if somebody wants to go ahead and procure tokens for that game or assets in the game, which are really planets in the Dark Forest game, then they have to go out there and actually play the game, or they have to hire a bunch of people to play the game, or they have to hire a bunch of coders to write plugins to get assets for the game. So it's just a very, very different place. I almost hesitate to call them companies anymore. They're just a different thing.
Yeah, there's so much about this answer that I just absolutely love. I mean, if you don't mind me pointing out two specific things. One was the focus on like composability or interoperability with, on Ethereum, everything natively has an API and you're really building these Lego bricks. I think that this is something that's totally undervalued compared with, people talk a lot about like trustlessness and how, your keys and your money and stuff is secured 100% guarantee with mathematical sort of mathematics-based cryptography. But I really think that the interoperability and composability aspects of Ethereum and smart contract platforms in general is where like a lot of the really awesome like user facing activity is gonna be. And the second thing, yeah, to the point about companies and it not even being clear what does a crypto organization look like, I think we're also seeing like a lot of the traditional, like at least one thing that's interesting to us working on Dark Forest is that the ways that I think we think about, you know, moats for crypto businesses or like what are the sources of strategic advantage are not so much things like proprietary technology so much as they are things like and things like that.
Yeah, on the second point, it's interesting how few crypto forks have actually succeeded because this is all open source. You'd think it would be really trivial and easy for someone to just fork something, maybe cut the, any pre-mine out, cut out any rewards that have gone to other people, and say, hey, come to our clone, and you're going to have better economics. Like a simple example would be you could take the Bitcoin blockchain, you could fork it, and you could create Bitcoin, call it Faircoin. And what you do is you cut out Satoshi's Genesis block, you cut out the Winklevoss, you cut out any large exchange address, and then you basically just airdrop Bitcoin to all the smaller holders and say, "Here we go, people," or you, airdrop it to another community and try and tempt them in. But that kind of thing just doesn't work in crypto. It turns out that these forks and reallocations have generally had a disastrous history. So I think you're right. It's much more about the community and the protocol and kind of the apps that are built on top and the people who are using it. These things are very loosely held together by these community-based network effects and Schelling points, and not really held together based on as much on economic incentives as it might initially appear, or purely economic incentives. The second part, which is what you mentioned first about composability, I think composability is probably, as you say, the most underrated thing about blockchains and crypto. The key here, I think, to focus on is that if you're Facebook, right, you're Mark Zuckerberg and you're running Facebook, you have to protect that database. That database, you're in charge of it, and if someone breaks in as a hacker, they steal incredibly valuable data, and it's very embarrassing to you. At the same time, your value as a company derives from the data. You own the Facebook social graph, and damn if you're going to share that with anybody. And then writing to that database is an extreme privilege. Like you negotiate with your product managers as to what the rules are for writing to that database, and you control access to that database. So that database is the magic keys, and you wrap all this proprietary code around the database to serve up the app, but it also protects ingress and egress out of that database. In crypto land, it's really interesting. We came up with a system where we basically said, we don't trust anybody. We don't trust anybody else out there. We are in a dark forest, to use your analogy. We're in a dark forest and we don't know who's walking out there, and everybody out there we just have to assume is a hostile actor. What we have to assume actually is that the majority of actors in the ecosystem are not hostile, but there are enough hostile actors out there that have to always treat any single actor as potentially hostile. So I am responsible for my own data. I have to protect my own data. So the user suddenly has to take on the heavy lift of handling private keys and bearer tokens and potentially losing their money, but they're responsible for securing their data. Now, in normie land, people can't even remember their password. And password resets don't work, and people lose their passwords, and they can't even hold on to that. In crypto land, you better remember your seed phrase, you better remember where you secured your coins, and if you lose them, you lose them. So it's the exact opposite. The burden of data security first and foremost lands on the user. But as soon as the user gets through that, then you put everything into this giant shared database where nobody trusts anybody, but everybody has control over their own data and it's encrypted. And now writing to the database is controlled by the miners and the blockchain consensus rules. So the write activity is very controlled. You can't read it unless the person with the private key lets you read it. And you certainly can't write into somebody else's account without their permission, their private key. So now the database is in this weird way open to everyone, but it's secure. It's completely secure against hostile actors. So now you no longer need this code to be closed. The code can be open. It's not just an open API, it's way beyond that. Every piece of code is open. You can connect to that database from any single angle that you want. And this is huge because now this is what enables composability. Now every application plugs into every other application anywhere it needs to. And the image that I have of crypto land is crypto's like Voltron. It's like all these little robots that look useless that are running around being built that look like toys. But eventually, when they snap together like Voltron or Legos, they build something much, much larger that basically just overwhelms the legacy financial system or the legacy gaming system or the legacy even social networks. So I think crypto is way underestimated because this combination of closed data and open source just allows it to create things that are much, much larger than we've experienced before. The entire community is essentially working on the same product. It's funny to me that the people in the AI community think that they're going to build this massive AGI that's world changing by working in their little closed silos, when in crypto land, every project is essentially cooperating with every other project. And that's probably more how you end up with an AGI, something that knows how to allocate value and takes advantage of all the code that's been built out there as opposed to small silos of code. I'll stop there.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much, Naval. I'll let the next person ask their question now. I don't want to drone on for too long about crypto, but awesome. Yeah, great answer.
Crypto's fun. It's my passion right now. So, all right, let's find somebody else. Gosh, I do not know who any of these people are, but here we go. Maybe I'll invite a couple of people up and they can sort of take turns.
Hi, Naval. Can
All
you hear
right.
me?
Yes, I can. Go ahead, Maxim.
Hi, Naval. So I'm an undergraduate computer science and cognitive science student, and I was wondering what your I've listened to your How to Get Rich podcast, and I found it very insightful. I was wondering, how do you go about picking? I know your answer might be, maybe follow the thing that you're most passionate about, but how do you find something that you're most passionate about in terms of wanting to start a future startup?
Yeah, so passion. Okay, so my answer on these things is usually not find out what you're most passionate about. That's actually a very unimaginative answer, and that's the really old answer where it's like people will either say, your parents will say do what's practical, and all the books will say do what you love. I don't think either is actually quite correct. I think the way that I like to phrase it, which is nuanced, and it's important to get the whole thing, is you want to find what feels like play to you, but looks like work to others. So both of those are true. Both of those have to be simultaneously true. So feels like play to you is the what you're passionate about part. So you'll naturally be good at it, you're into it, you're curious about it, you enjoy doing it. But looks like work to others, that is equally important. That means that it has in society, that thing is seen as work by other people, and therefore it is likely to have some value. So you want to find the intersection of those two. And that's not easy. I'm not saying you're necessarily going to find it trivially, nor that you're going to find it, on a timeline. When you're in college, one of the false dichotomies of college is this idea that you're expected to decide on your career that you're going to do for the next 10, 20, 50, 100 years, whatever, through path during this very short couple of year stint. And unfortunately, I think we lock people into lifetimes of drudgery where they basically say, well, I'm going to go be a lawyer. They go to law school, now they're locked into law, whether they love the law or not, or the practice of law or not, or investment banking or medicine or what have you. These are straitjackets. It's like too early, especially now as careers have gotten longer and people live longer, getting them to commit for like their entire lives based on this short stint is too much. So I would say, especially at your age, and given that you're in computers and you're basically coding, don't overthink it. Just build things. Just build whatever you feel like. Build toys, build apps for yourself. Just do whatever you enjoy. Now, to most people, sitting in front of a computer and writing code looks like work. So almost anything you do in front of a computer, especially with code that is fun to you, that feels like play to you, satisfies kind of the criteria. So I would say just code for fun. If you code for fun, you will eventually find your way to something you're passionate about and that you can make money in. Now, I think that's somewhat unique to you because A, you have the luxury of time because you're very young, even though I know in college they pressure you and it may feel like you don't have that luxury of time. You really do have the luxury of time. And the second reason is because you're coding. If you're coding in computer science and cognitive science, you're good at using the tool that is, the most powerful tool ever invented by humanity that gives you permissionless leverage. So you're actually way ahead of the curve. Unfortunately, most people, when they ask these kinds of questions, most of people, when they ask them, my answer starts with some variant of learn to code, which I hate to say it because I don't want to be glib. I know it's not an easy thing to do, but at the same time, it's like if you were alive when literacy was first getting widespread and you were not literate, someone who really had your best interest at heart would tell you, hey, go learn to read and write. It's just too important to not do it. So in the same way, when numeracy was becoming more widespread, they would say, hey, go become good at mathematics. Now, literacy and numeracy are prerequisites for programming. So now I can just say go program, because it means you have to be literate, you have to be numerate, and you have to be facile with the best tool that we've ever invented, where you can permissionlessly create and extract leverage. So I think you're already most of the way there. You just need to code for fun. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Naval. Thank you.
All right. Who wants to go next?
Lex can go. It's up to him, or whoever wants to. I can go.
Yeah, go ahead, Dev.
All right.
I'll bet. I don't think Lex has a question about his business. I've already harassed him about his, but
I know, right?
No, I actually do.
He does. Okay, excellent. We'll go with him next, but Dev was here first. Let's just go in order.
Sweet. Okay, yeah, I got to do this brief intro. So I run the Smart Glasses group and Neural Interfaces group here in Clubhouse. We're just gonna have like Apple employees, or sorry, give their opinion for the Smart Glasses group, and then Neuralink for the neural interfaces. And my question pertains to neural interfaces. I'm building a neural interface software application. I'm wondering, from candid feedback from you, if this is a fool's errand, given that it's so far off that we're uncertain the pathway of these devices so far. And if I can't get it to run on Neuralink, then I'll just build my own device. Is basically my pathway.
I think it's probably too early to bet on Neuralink, because we don't really know what they're doing, and as far as I know, they don't really have a widespread, device that's announced or in development that you can really target. I don't think that the area is one to dismiss. There's definitely something there. The question is, on what timescale does it arrive, and what does it look like? So if you're going to devote your life to neural interfaces, or at least, let's call it decades to neural interfaces, because you're genuinely interested in the topic, then you may as well tinker on it now. And if you can do it in someone else's dime, so much the better. I just wouldn't necessarily bet on a specific platform emerging on the timescale that you need. Platforms take time. Like I was joking around with Joe Rogan on here, a little while back, and I basically said VR isn't working today, and I meant that partially jokingly and partially like in the sense that it's just not mainstream. It's not like PlayStations or iPhones where it's everywhere. But people took that the wrong way. Partially, on Twitter, it's fun to take excerpts and get outraged, but some people took that to mean like, oh, Naval doesn't believe in VR, AR. No, I think it'll eventually get there. I think it kind of has to. But that said, it's just obviously not there today, because we're talking on our iPhones. We're not wearing VR headsets right now. So the same way, I think with Neuralink, the timing is everything, right? And the timing on something like that, it's pretty fuzzy. It could be 5 years, it could be 20 years. Do you want to dig into that a little bit more, or is
Yeah.
that kind of satisfactory high level?
Right. Yeah. From my understanding, right, there's the Kurzweil steps, and there's weak AI, strong AI, singularity. Not to get down that line, but basically, my understanding of their product roadmap, is they have, they're trying to get accessibility in quadriplegics back to default accessible bodies, and then they'll move on to, now how do we encapsulate memory? Now how do we write back to the brain? Right, because that's part of Elon's strategy right now, is to figure out, well, how are we going to figure out how to play music in our heads without needing headphones? And so I was just curious.
Well,
your
I think unfortunately, I think that there's just too many unknowns here.
Mhm.
We don't have a general theory of how the brain actually works. We don't have a good general theory of how creativity works. We don't have a good general theory of how human intelligence works. So I think a lot of these fields like AI and Neuralink, they're searching for a scientific or a philosophical breakthrough, not really engineering breakthroughs. I know people in the fields want to believe that it's just all engineering, but I don't think that's the case. I think that there are philosophical and scientific breakthroughs required, and those breakthroughs happen on their own schedules. They could happen tomorrow, literally tomorrow, or they could take 50 years, and it's just very, very hard to accelerate those things. So I'm not sure I would bet my career, at least my technology and business career, counting on a scientific or philosophical breakthrough.
Right, that makes the most sense. Okay, I'll kick myself to the audience.
Yeah, thank you. Good questions. Lex.
Hey, Noel. As a quick side comment, you probably had a bunch of offline conversation with Joe Rogan, but I'm pretty sure he wants to do like a 3-hour rant with you on his podcast about VR. I think he's still upset about your VR comment. which is hilarious.
Yeah, I mean, look, that Joe's not a technologist, right? And so I think it's easy to get snowed by VR. The problem with VR is that right now there's no apps that people are putting on their headsets that are kind of mainstreamish that you can just use for hours at a time and you keep coming back to, right? And VR is kind of in this little uncanny valley where, and I don't understand VR well enough, so you should get someone like Eugene Wei or who was a guy who started Oculus, Parker, or maybe like John Carmack, or people like that will have Chris Dixon. They'll have a much better viewpoint on why it's not quite there today. I mean, the simplest thing is if VR had been working, they wouldn't have sold Oculus for 1.65 billion to Facebook. It would have been bigger than Facebook. It would have been the next Apple, right? And yeah, I know they've shipped 1 million headsets or something, but when something works like that, you ship 100 million headsets. Look, everybody wants Ready Player One. You see that kind of situation, and it's captivating. But then the reality is, you put a helmet on your head, and 15 minutes later, you kind of feel a little dizzy, maybe a little nauseous. The games aren't that compelling. You can't move around that much. It just feels weird. It's good for very, very specific things, but those are not yet mass market use cases. What's interesting is this rumor that leaked about the new Apple headset that they're going to release in 2022. This is a rumor, of course, so take it with a grain of salt, but those are mixed reality AR, VR glasses. And that seems to me to be a completely different approach, because the current VR approach is we're going to strap this thing to your head and black out all other light. Whereas the Apple approach seems more pragmatic, saying, no, these are glasses. We're going to try it in the real world. And of course, glasses failed in the past. That was Google Glass, but it's easy to explain away those failures. The battery life was awful, and the processor wasn't there at the time. The camera wasn't there at the time. So maybe we've advanced the stage where we're not going to end up with the general magic device. We're going to end up with the iPhone. But it's a jump. There's still a jump required. Now, the good news is the jump required for VR, I don't think it's a scientific breakthrough. I think it's just technology and engineering. And so they'll get there, and the time frame might be as short as 3 to 4 years, it might be as long as 10 to 20, but it'll get there in some context where most of us will be using VR for certain kinds of things. Like for social networks, it's not clear that you'll necessarily need VR for at least this kind of a social interaction. For example, we could be doing Clubhouse right now with the 3D avatars, or we could be doing it all with video, but we choose not to, because really the important thing here is the voice communication. So we just go ahead with that. It's like the easiest form of communication. So very often we give up fidelity for ease of use and to just boil things down to their essence. And I don't think VR will be any different. But for certain applications, like for games or for like real world overlays, or watching videos or movies, or kind of immersive environments where you're talking, where you really want to feel like you're connecting with somebody, VR is going to be very hard to beat once it starts working. So
Yeah.
that was an aside, though.
Yes, and aside, and I apologize for that. It does feel that we're one good idea and implementation away from a breakthrough. If you think about Clubhouse technology has been around. The obvious voice communication has been around forever, but something about this implementation, something about the design, something about the simplicity, connected with people, and
Well,
perhaps
this is a really good question, right? So this is kind of goes back to like the great man or great woman theory of history, right? So in history, there's this debate about whether it's shaped by individuals like, Hitler and Churchill and Einstein, or is it just that that's the person who happened to be there at their time to reflect the anger of the populace or the inevitable demographic shift? And this is debated, but for example, in science, there's this concept of simultaneous discovery, which happens all the time. Usually, when you find someone invents something, someone else in a different part of the world invented or discovered it roughly the same time, give or take. So, at least in science, the great man theory of history tends to get refuted. And even in politics, I think you make a good argument that it kind of gets refuted. The same kind of question kind of arises here, which is like with Clubhouse, was Clubhouse inevitable in that somebody would have created Clubhouse in 2020? Or was it the great person, right? Was it Paul Davison and Rowan Seth, or like uniquely qualified and talented? And of course, there's some truth to both, but where does it really come down? And I actually think that it would have happened anyway. I do not think that it was, necessarily, yes, they're the best team to do it, and they jumped on it first and they executed flawlessly. But I think if they hadn't, somebody else would have. Why do I say that? Well, I think one is there's a zeitgeist that this thing was needed/wanted. I believe Twitter was working on Twitter Spaces even before they saw Clubhouse. I'm not sure of that, but I have reason to believe that from some conversations that I had with Kayvon in the past, who's the head of product at Twitter. And also, I know because I wanted a product like this. I pitched this product to David King a long time ago, who actually tried to build it as something else. I forget what he called it. Oh, it's called Fireside, from Fireside Chats. And then when he heard that Twitter was working on something related, which is what Twitter Spaces turned into, he backed off and he stopped working on it. And then Paul Davison and Rowan started with Talk Show, and they pivoted into Clubhouse and they launched. So there were enough other people who were exploring this space and trying to solve this problem that I think something would have popped up. Now, why now? Why 2020? Why did it take off in 2020? I think one easy answer is COVID. You know, people were locked up and, you know, wanted to communicate and connect. So that's a big one, kind of like Zoom taking off at the same time. But that's not the only answer. I think the other answer is, if I were to do a show of hands of how many people in this room are actually using AirPods right now or some kind of a wireless headphones, it would actually be really high. And it would be high enough that it would make the difference. You know, that plus COVID lockdowns would be enough to tip from something like this not being able to achieve critical mass to being able to achieve critical mass. So I think wireless headsets actually have a lot to do with it, or I should say high quality, easy to use, portable wireless headsets.
Okay, so my actual original question was related to the great man, great woman in history, and I promise to shut up after this question and leave it to Sam. Um, without you grilling me further on the actual on the actual startup idea, suppose one has an idea or a couple of ideas related that I am fully equipped to implement all by myself. So I'm a technologist and I can build it all myself. It's a software-based initial prototype, but the prototype is such that it would be you could similar to Clubhouse in the sense, I believe I could build a prototype of Clubhouse. I'm not building a competitor, but my question is, how far can you go alone? My sense is I would like to go alone as far as possible and show to the world there's a compelling prototype. Is that a fool's errand?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I think there's a related, I'm going to answer the question in a related but different way, which is when you create a business, when you create a product, what are you doing? What is the point of leverage? What is the most important thing? It's the creativity. It's the act of creating the right thing. If you create the right thing, you will find product market fit and the world will beat a path to your door. If you create the wrong thing, you miss. If, for example, if Paul and Rohan had spent their time instead of creating Clubhouse, they'd created something just slightly different that didn't catch, then no amount of hard work they put in would have mattered. No amount of how much of a team they'd hired would have mattered. It's that getting that creative spark right.